Welcome to the shop, Steve here at SKS Props, and not long ago I finished my take on the Deku Shield and the Kokiri Sword from Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Now I wanted to further my Legend of Zelda prop collection, but a lot of my fellow builders out there have made some of the major ones. So you see the Master Sword and you see Link's main shield all over the place. I wanted to go a different direction. I wanted to make something small, something that anyone could throw together in an afternoon, so I figured it's about time that I made the Dungeon Boss Master Key. Now this definitely is an iconic piece, but it goes along great with the other ones that I've already done. This, of course, is made all out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials, and I want to show you guys what it takes to put this together and paint it, so let's go ahead and get started. Now for the boss key, I didn't want it small, I wanted it a decent size, so I scaled it to the props that I had previously made. Now this template was created in Photoshop, and you can find a free download for this over on my website in case you would like to build your own. So this template was printed off, and I start by removing all the pieces around the circle in the middle. This piece is measured out, and I adjust the slide on my perfect circle jig to cut the correct diameter. Now for this, I'm going to cut 2 circles out of 10mm HD foam and 1 piece out of 4mm foam. Between these 3 pieces, it'll give a decent thickness to the overall prop. Now on the 4mm piece, I'm going to use a hole saw attached to my drill press. This is going to give me a perfect circle cut out for the interior. Now if you don't have a hole saw, it's no problem, just mark out a 2.5-inch circle and cut it out by hand. To clean up the cut, I use a smooth sanding drum attached to a flex shaft on my Dremel rotary tool. Now all these pieces can be stacked together, and I start with the 2 10mm HD foam pieces by adhering them with some Bob Smith super glue. A light heat treatment is applied to the 4mm foam just to close the cells, and then I apply some Bob Smith super glue and press all these pieces together. So this was a fairly quick way to get the shape for the top and the cutout for the insert. Now for the blade that will attach to the head of the key, I'm going to be using a 20mm HD foam round dowel. This dowel is lined up with the template, marked, and then cut to fit using a utility knife. Now the dowel on its own won't be very strong, so I'm going to insert a metal rod. In this instance, the metal rod just happens to be a coat hanger that's been cut to fit. So the metal rod gets pressed into the dowel to give it some stability and to keep it straight, and a little bit of super glue is used to tack it into place. Now before I glue the blade on, I use my smooth sanding drum to round over the head of the key. This same drum is also used to taper the end of the blade and remove some of the material from the top. To round over the bottom of the blade, I start by using the rotary tool, but then switch over to a sanding sponge to give it a gradual curve. A light heat treatment can then be applied to the foam, and you can see just how smooth that surface ended up being. I then check the blade for fit, and you can see how removing a little bit of that material from the top makes it fit flush, and then I use a little bit of Bob Smith super glue to glue it into place. For these detail rings at the top of the blade, I'm going to be using some 10mm HD foam half round dowels. These types of dowels are really great for adding little details to your props and costumes very quickly. These half-round dowels are cut just long enough to wrap around the keyblade and then glued into place. Any extra foam that's left will be knocked down with a rotary tool until it's sanded flush. Now I can cut away the teeth from the blade template. These pieces are transferred onto some 10mm HD foam with a pencil. Once complete, the foam is taken over to the bandsaw to be cut out. Now for this, I want the profiles of these to still remain pretty sharp, but I want all the sides rounded over. The rotary tool is used to knock down the edges of the foam and to add a groove in the back that matches the contour of the foam dowel. This same process is also replicated on the larger tooth. After a light heat treatment, these teeth can be glued into place, making sure that I line them up perfectly with the head of the key. To fabricate the horns on either side of the head of the key, I start by gluing 2 pieces of 10mm HD foam together and transfer my templates with a pencil. These pieces can then easily be cut out on my bandsaw, and as I've mentioned before, if you don't have a bandsaw, it's no problem. You can cut these out by hand and refine them with your rotary tool. Once cut out, I use my smooth sanding drum to round over all the edges and to taper the top of the horns. I add a little bit of heat to seal the foam, and then I can glue these to the head of the key, making sure that it's in the middle, and I leave a little bit of room on either side. I did mark the location from my template just to make sure that the horns are evenly spaced on either side. I start by transferring the template onto some 10mm foam, and I cut these pieces bigger than they need to be. After they're sanded down and heat sealed, I can cut off just the tip of this piece, which is all I need. I can then take my rotary tool and carve away a little bit of the foam so it matches the curve of the key blade. These pieces can then be attached to either side, matching the alignment of the horns. For the detail piece surrounding the eye, I start by removing it from the template and tracing it onto the key so I know exactly where it's going to go. I'm going to be using some 2mm HD foam for this piece, and I start by cutting it out with some scissors, and then for the little cuts on the side, I use a scalpel blade. I take my time when cutting this piece because it needs to look just right. There aren't a ton of details on this key. Once cut out, some Bob Smith super glue is added, and I can line it up to the marks that I had made earlier. The circle for the eye is traced onto some 6mm HD foam. The sides of this piece can then be rounded over with my Dremel rotary tool, and I use a sanding sponge to finish it off. After the heat seal, this piece can also be glued down, and it gives a really cool 3D effect to the top of this key. Now, because there's not a lot of details to this key, I would like it to be pretty clean, so I'm going to use some quick seal to fill a lot of the gaps. Quick seal is applied with some silicone tip sculpting tools, and I can smooth this out with a little bit of water on my finger. To seal this foam and get it ready for paint, I'm going to start by using some FX brand clear primer. This primer is applied to the piece with a 1-inch flat brush, making sure to minimize my brush strokes. Once the key has been completely covered, a hairdryer is used to speed up the dry time. Showing you guys some color theory, I'm going to be using some red oxide primer as my base because it will make the gold look richer. For my main color, I'm going to be using Golden Brand Iridescent Bronze, and as I've mentioned before, you don't need any water with this paint. It's very opaque, and it's applied with a 1/2-inch filbert brush. I really like this particular color, and even with a single coat, it has a very reflective sheen. For the purple around the eye, I'm going to be using 2 different colors from the Plaid FX line, Voodoo Violet and Malevolent. Voodoo Violet is applied first with some small detail brushes as the base color, and then once that dries, Malevolent can be painted as a highlight on top. Now, because this key is pretty simplistic, I'd like for the gold to have a color shift in the recesses, so I'm going to be using Utrecht brand Iridescent Gold and Iridescent Russet as a shade. This color mixture is applied at the base of the horns and some of the crevices just to give it some variation. The detailed design around the head of the key is first drawn on with a pencil, and then once everything is spaced out, I can follow those lines with a detail brush. The color I'm using here is a little bit of that iridescent gold mixed with some Mars black. Now it's time to start building up the colors for the focal point of this piece, which will be the eye. I start off by using Liquitex cadmium-free red medium mixed with a little Mars black. This will act as my base layer and is painted over the entire surface of the eye. While that's drying, I do a thin layer of the iridescent bronze over the design just to knock it back a bit. Now I can start adding the highlights to the eye by adding a little more cadmium red to the mixture. Switching over to a liner brush, I add a decent amount of water to the cadmium red, and I start making these striations on the iris. Now the first ones that I lay down are pretty thick. I'm just building up layers at this point. But as you can see, as I work my way around the eye, I'm adding less water and more pigment each time. I go ahead and fill in the center of the eye, and now I can move on to the next color. For my next layer, I'm going to be using Cadmium Red Hue from Utrecht. Now this paint is quite a bit thinner than the Liquitex, so it's just used as a glaze over the entire eye. The pupil of the eye is painted freehand with a detail brush using Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black. For the next highlight on the eye, I'm going to be using FX brand Orbital Orange. Now this paint is also pretty thin, so it allows me to build it up in several layers as I work my way around the iris. Utrecht brand titanium white is used to put the final highlight on the eye. Just like the pupil, this is carefully painted on with a detail brush. The first layer is pretty thin just to get the general shape, and then I add no water to finish it off. Now I want this monster eye to have a wet and glossy look, so I'm going to be using Vallejo brand gloss varnish as a sealer. So you all can see what it takes to put together your own dungeon boss key, and this is the kind of project that you could easily put together in an afternoon, but it goes right along with all of your Legend of Zelda props. Now hopefully you guys are enjoying these videos. If you are, give them a thumbs up, share them with your friends and family, and remember, if you're building any of my builds or using HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best HD foam.